neuropeptide oxytocin enhances information sharing and group-making decision quality, or in simpler terms, oxytocin encourages information sharing and leads to better group decisions. So why should we care how to work better in groups? So as students, we have to work in groups all the time, which is news to pretty much none of us. And I know that can be a really difficult process, especially when you have to deal with a lot of competing opinions and people that may not disagree with you, and when you're dealing with multiple sources of information. So we're going to look at what makes group work difficult, how we can tackle some of those issues, and we're also going to look at how what we find makes group work really hard is actually super valuable and can lead to a better outcome. So let's do some background on group work. The main idea here is that groups are capable of making higher quality decisions than individuals are, but this is with certain factors in mind. So group work is effective when all of the members cooperatively share their uniquely held information and ideas, and they constructively discuss any doubts they have, any criticisms they have, and different competing scenarios. And also, for group work to be effective, the focus on the group must be moderate. So you can't be too focused on yourself, but you also can't be overly focused on the group. On the other hand, there are certain factors that can actually undermine group work also. So conformity pressures lead members to share commonly held information instead of their uniquely held information, and that can undermine group work. And also, when members feel the excessive need to affiliate and agree with others to sort of reach this unanimous decision for the group, but when that decision is reached by self-censorship and not sharing all of your ideas, that can actually undermine group work. And all of these negative factors combined sort of contribute to this mode of thinking called groupthink, and groupthink has been shown several times throughout history to actually be really dangerous. So if any of you have ever heard of the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster or the Challenger disaster, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but those were both shuttles launched by NASA, and they failed. They actually exploded because of malfunctions of certain parts of the shuttle. And sort of doubts about these parts of the shuttles had been circulating before they were launched, but because the people at NASA fell victim to this groupthink mindset, they didn't actually emphasize the doubts that they were having enough before launching the shuttle. So now let's talk about oxytocin and what we know about oxytocin from previous research. So oxytocin is a 9-amino acid long hormone and a neurotransmitter that's produced in the hypothalamus, and it's been linked to the group decision-making process. So it's been hypothesized that oxytocin raises the salience of social cues, so it makes them more noticeable and seemingly more important, and it shifts the focus from self to group. And it's also been hypothesized to have some negative links, such as increases in dishonesty, envy, and gloating. So here's some information about the experiment that they did to look at the relationship between oxytocin and group work. So they conducted a double-blind placebo-controlled study, which just means that the researchers didn't know who was receiving the placebo or oxytocin, and the participants didn't know either. So there were 123 total participants, 63 of which received oxytocin, and 60 of them received the placebo, and they were organized into 41 three-person groups. And in those groups were either 3 members that all received oxytocin or 3 members that all received the placebo. There was no there were no mixed groups. And what they had to do was perform a hidden profile task, and that just means that there was information that was distributed amongst them that was shared and unshared, so unique information. And the task that they were given was to solve a murder case. So they were given both incriminating and exonerating pieces of information. And something to keep in mind here is that when all of the pieces of information are considered, there was one suspect that was clearly the correct choice. But because not every individual received every piece of information, they would have to discuss. So here's the timeline of the experiment. They started by administering either the oxytocin or the placebo. Then for the next 45 minutes, they just did filler tasks that were pretty much unrelated to the experiment. Then for the next 10 minutes, they individually read the instructions and the case, and then they decided, each participant for themselves, who they thought the correct choice was. Then they got into groups, they discussed in their groups, and then made a new decision after group discussion as to who they thought was the correct choice. And then the questionnaires were just feedback after the experiment was done, but that didn't impact the results at all. So here's how the experiment was set up. There were 3 suspects, A, B, and C, and the members in each group were labeled X, Y, and Z, so 3 members per group. And the incriminating items are in red and exonerating items are in green. So for suspect A, there were 6 total pieces of information. The numbers that are not bolded are the shared information, and the bolded ones are the unique information. So for suspect A, pieces 1 through 3 were all incriminating, and all 3 members in the group received pieces 1 through 3. And 4, 5, and 6 were unique, so only member X got 4, only member Y got 5, and only member Z got 6. For suspect B, similar idea, but there were 9 pieces of information. 1 through 6 were shared and incriminating, but 7, 8, and 9 were the unique pieces, and they were all exonerating. And the same setup for suspect C. So this is just a different representation of the same information that's up there. So suspect A, you can see X, Y, and Z, half of 3 out of the 6 pieces of information were shared, so that's why they're in the same section. And the separated ones are the unique pieces of information. And you can see the same for B and C. Does anyone have any questions on that? Yeah.
Did the group members know they were receiving unique information, or would they have to figure that out through group discussion?
They would have to figure that out. I mean, it was a hidden profile task, so they might have known, but they had to share their uniquely held information.
Okay.
Yeah.
So was there incriminating and exonerating information for each suspect?
No, for suspect A, there were 6 pieces and they were all incriminating. And for suspect B and C, there were 3 pieces of exonerating each. And those were all unique. Yeah. Okay, so here are the results. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of total information exchange, and you can see it's split between shared information on the left and unique information on the right. So in terms of shared information, there was more information exchange in the placebo group than the oxytocin group. But for unique information, there was more exchange in the oxytocin group than the placebo group. So based on that, what can we conclude increased oxytocin leads to?
Increased willingness to share information in a group.
Yeah, so increased unique information sharing. And here's some more results. So you can see placebo and oxytocin. The scale on the bottom shows how much unique information was exchanged. So the further to your right that you are, the more unique information was exchanged. And the green circles show when the correct decision was reached, and the orange triangles show when the incorrect decision was reached. So for the placebo group, you can see there was a lot less unique information exchange because this side is the shared information exchange. And you can see where there was more shared information exchange, they reached the incorrect decision more. But in the oxytocin group, there was a lot more unique information exchange, and they reached the correct decision more often. So just to put some numbers to that, 74% of the oxytocin groups reached the correct decision after their group discussion, but only 47% of the placebo groups reached the correct decision after their discussion. And a comparison that we can draw here is that since there were 3 suspects, go ahead. Okay. Since there were 3 suspects, your chances of getting it correct if you just randomly guess are 1 in 3. So that's a 33.3% chance of getting it correct if you just guess randomly. So the 74% of oxytocin groups getting the correct answer is significantly higher than success rates by chance, whereas the placebo is not really as much higher. Yeah.
Do you know how they were administering oxytocin and placebo to the subjects?
Yeah, it was like intranasal. So they like
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was like an inhalation.
So based on that data, what can we conclude increased unique information sharing leads to? Alessia?
Like the correct answer.
Yeah, more correct decisions. So if we put these two together, so now we know increased oxytocin leads to increased unique information sharing, and we know that increased unique information sharing leads to more correct decisions. So when we put both of those together, what can we conclude? Vicki?
Increased oxytocin leads to more correct decisions.
So that's what they have here in this figure. Increased oxytocin leads to increased unique information sharing, and increased unique information sharing leads to more correct decisions. So they were able to conclude that increased oxytocin leads to more correct decisions. Now, one of the researchers' concerns going into this was this idea of oxytocin-induced conformity, because what they already knew was that it switches the focus from self to group. So what if the focus on the group was too high, and that resulted in conformity? So what do they actually find to be the relationship between oxytocin and conformity? So in the oxytocin and placebo groups, there were an equal number of answer switches. And by answer switches, I mean, if you remember back to the timeline, they decided individually what they thought was the correct answer, and then they had to decide in their group, so when that answer switched. But more of the switches, 81% of them in the oxytocin groups, were to the correct answer, whereas less of them, only 56% of them in the placebo groups, were to the correct answer. So equal number of switches, but more were correct with oxytocin and less were correct with placebo. Yeah.
Is that because of the difference in the type of information that was shared, or did the researchers say like, oh, it's because of the oxytocin directly? Do you get what I mean?
No.
Okay, so if oxytocin is inducing like people to share more secret information, then is that switching to the correct answer a result of that sharing information, or just because of the oxytocin itself? Or is it? Are you able to separate the two?
Yeah, so what they found was that, so oxytocin pushes you to share that unique information, but the sharing of unique information is what actually helps you reach the correct decision. Because if you didn't have the unique information that your other members had, then you wouldn't be able to know who was the correct answer. So what they hypothesized based on that was that conformity is maybe based on monitoring our own and other group members' capabilities. So maybe we're more willing to conform to the opinions of members in our group that are most knowledgeable about a certain subject, and maybe we're less willing to conform to those who are worse performing than we are. Okay, so since we're probably not going to administer oxytocin every time we work in groups, what do you think is the takeaway here? Sahar?
To have more unique information so then you can make better decisions.
Yeah, so it's sort of this idea that oxytocin has helped us learn some important things about group work and sort of gain some concrete evidence about that. And some of those things are what makes group work successful, what are the challenges we face, what makes it not successful, and sort of what's the value in group work. And the main idea here is that even though oxytocin may push people to share more unique information per se, these are all things that we have a certain degree of control over, and we can choose, like consciously, to implement what is beneficial for group work and maybe to stay away from what's not so helpful for group work. So here are some main takeaways of things that you can do the next time you find yourselves working in groups. So you can share your thoughts even if you think that other people might disagree. What we've learned is that sharing your thoughts when they're unique is really important. If you have any doubts or disagreements about what other people are saying, you should share them and not fall to conforming pressures. And you should also openly hear what your other group members have to say, even if you don't agree with them. And now that we know the value in group work and the value in these sort of different opinions, you can keep that in mind next time you're working in a group. So you don't really need oxytocin to make you do all of these things. You can sort of make the decision to do them yourselves. So last, let's talk about some unanswered questions that we still have. In this experiment, there was clearly one correct choice. There was a right answer. But what happens when there is no right answer? What happens when it's more of a matter of opinion rather than just right and wrong? What would oxytocin do in a situation like that? Would you have an increase in conformity issues? Would there be greater competition between different people because it's more of a matter of opinion? And then another thing they sort of touched on at the end of the paper is what is actually allowing oxytocin to result in better decisions. So how can we bridge that gap? What they thought was that maybe oxytocin increases trust within group members, and then that leads to better decisions. So we still sort of have to fill that gap and see what is between oxytocin and the correct decision. Thanks. Allie,
So how did they know that oxytocin was connected to making decisions?
how did they know that what?
Yeah, like how did they know?
Beforehand?
Yeah, beforehand.
Yeah, so there was previous research done on the relationship between oxytocin and group work. So they sort of took what they knew from that and built on it to see what they found agreed or disagreed. Alessia.
Do you know the rate of correct decisions for the individual work before they worked in groups? Like, was it higher in oxytocin already?
No. Go back to that.
Like, before they worked in groups,
Uh-huh.
was the rate of, like, correct decision making the same for both groups? Like, oxytocin versus...
Yeah, they had an average of the same number of correct versus incorrect.
Yeah.
Did they try different dosage sizes for
No.
the drug? No.
No, it's all the same.
So do you know how they decided upon the size?
I'm not sure. Sorry. Andrew?
Did your paper talk at all about like the roles of people in like groups, like a group leader, and like whether or not that affects like the how well a group does?
So it didn't talk about like if roles were assigned, but like I had here, you can sort of not decide those positions for yourself, but they hypothesize that maybe when you're in a group dynamic, you're sort of able to, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, just like assess who knows the most, who knows the least, and adjust your conformity based on that. So maybe once you assess those abilities, sort of a leader will, like a role of a leader would form. But it didn't talk about if you had like pre-decided you're going to be the leader, this is what's going to happen. Mr. Maxwell.
So obviously it would be unethical to spike everybody's drinks with oxytocin before a group decision. But are there things that you can do behaviorally, and maybe you don't know, and it's okay, that could increase oxytocin naturally?
I don't know.
That is cool. That is
But that's a really good question.
Sure.
Give birth?
Yeah.
I'm on.
Isn't that?
Yeah.
Well, stay on sticky, like warm brownies or.
Really, think about it. When you go to Thanksgiving dinner, how do you feel when you walk in the door and you smell all those foods? That's the feel good hormone. Those are the effects from the feel good hormone.
Probably just like lower your stress level, right?
What does oxytocin do in the first place? Like it's a
What's like a feel good hormone?
it's just feel good hormone. It's like okay.
Wait.
It's like so random.
How did they make sure to check?
Okay, I'm gonna. We have more.
Hi. I know the paper goes a little bit into talking about whether you consciously or subconsciously assign kind of who's the best members and who's the worst. But does it talk about group size and how that may affect your willingness?
Does it talk about what?
Group size.
Group size. No, it didn't touch on group size at all. They were all just 3-person groups. Ethan?
How do they like decide on the people that would make up all of these groups? Like, how do they make sure that like people weren't naturally just smarter or like, had more experience in this?
I believe it said that they were all, it was just on a volunteer basis. So like they didn't really assess how smart someone was beforehand or like try and organize groups to have like different ability levels. It was just random. Yeah.
So one group was either all placebo or all oxytocin?
Yeah, there were no groups with placebo and oxytocin.
Were all the participants the same age, like the same education level? Like all high school students or all like college graduates?
It didn't say. It didn't. No, I don't know. Another